The first time I had two things to do, run the country and survive, says Donald Trump of his first term in office. And the second time, I run the country and the world. He was speaking to the journalists Ashley Parker and Michael Shearer from The Atlantic magazine. They've also talked to dozens of top advisors, allies, adversaries, and confidants. And Ashley Parker joins me now. Ashley, hello. Welcome to Times Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. Look, so you had an interview planned with Trump, and he then cancels. And so you phone him up on his own smartphone, and he answers. How does this work?
That's right. So we had an interview scheduled, and kind of once it became known to a wider circle in the White House and in Trump's orbit, someone, we don't know who, but kind of goes into the Oval and shows Trump, things I've written, things I've said that they know the president won't like, so he cancels the interview. And he cancels it quite publicly in a Truth Social post where he attacks me and my co-author, Michael Shearer, by name. So we realized we're not going to get the interview. And in the process, someone, without divulging sources and methods, someone sort of felt bad for us in the way things had gone down. And we were able to get the president's personal cell phone number. And so one weekend morning, Michael actually just calls him on his personal cell phone. The president obviously doesn't know the number. He doesn't have Michael Shearer's cell phone number saved in his phone. But he picks up, he answers, and they speak for 20 minutes. And that is the first interview we end up having with the president for this story, although there is a second one.
Yeah, and the subsequent interview is in person.
Yes, the subsequent one is at the very last minute. The story has already closed, kind of gone to print, and it's sort of a stop the presses moment when we get a call from the White House saying, can you come into the Oval Office tomorrow afternoon? So myself and Michael and the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeff Goldberg, who the president also invites, all head to the Oval Office for what turns out to be an hour-long interview.
I mean, I don't want to talk too much about the journalistic details of how this came about, but this is sort of so remarkable. You said just now he's not a fan of your magazine. He'd attacked you personally on Truth Social. What he said is he called you a radical left lunatic and said you'd been as terrible as possible for as long as he'd known you. And yet he's inviting you into the White House. He's also inviting in your editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, as you said, who is the guy to whom the Houthis group chat was leaked. So you'd think he'd be hostile, and yet the interview sounds quite warm. Was he warm?
Yes. So a couple of things. I mean, his data point, it seems, for calling me a radical left lunatic is that I accept the facts that Joe Biden won the presidency in 2020, right? That's the crime I've committed. And what was interesting when we go into the Oval Office, and having covered Trump since 2015, I sort of expected this, is the way to understand Donald Trump is he is someone who is always trying to win the minute, the hour, the day, the person directly in front of him. And so, depending on who that audience is and what the medium is, that is going to change. So, in the Oval Office, with three writers from The Atlantic, including Jeff Goldberg, Donald Trump was the version of himself that can be incredibly charming and charismatic and welcoming and respectful. And there was also an interesting moment. Jeff was the one who was added to this attack planning signal chain, sort of informally called Signalgate. And Trump in his Truth Social post had said Signalgate was, quote, I believe something like somewhat of a success. And so Jeff actually asked him about it. He said, what did you mean it was somewhat of a success? Did you mean that we exposed vulnerabilities in your operational security apparatus that you have now taken steps to solve? And the president basically said, no, it was a success because you guys owned the news cycle. And Trump was not wrong. I mean, I remember thinking at the time, in a world where, attention spans are so short and we are always drinking from this Trump fire hose, it was remarkable that for 3 full days, and frankly, really a week, the story everywhere that the entire country and in some ways the world was paying attention to was Signalgate in the Atlantic. And so for Trump, there was a part of it, it felt like that was a sort of like game recognizes game. He had to give Jeff Goldberg, grudging respect for taking the news cycle away for him for a hot minute.
You got great ratings, as he'd say it. You got great ratings. That's all that matters. Look, let's return to that quote I read out at the beginning, where he says, the first time I had two things to do to run the country and survive, and the second time I run the country and the world. Tell us about that quote. So he sees his presidency as his first presidency as just a survival course. Now he sounds like Napoleon. Now he's running the world. The world, he says.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I've covered Trump since 2015, but I covered his first term, I covered the beginnings now of his second term, both campaigns. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this story was because we were so struck by, at least in the opening months, the first 100 days, how different Trump's presidency feels. His confidence, his aggressiveness, his brazenness, his willing to shatter through democratic norms, the creativity in certain ways of him and his team. And people can agree or disagree on if this is sort of net good. That's a real debate. But it just feels so different. And we sort of felt like we wanted to understand how he was able to come back and what lessons he learned in that process that allowed him to come back. And Donald Trump is famously and frankly wildly not introspective. But it was interesting to hear him, and that's why that's the quote on the cover of the magazine. And I assume that's why it struck you as well. It was interesting to hear him put it in those terms. He gets to Washington the first term. No one expected him to win. He didn't really even expect to win. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know who to fill his government with. He's never been a politician before, so he doesn't have that bank of people to put even in the agencies or any real loyalists. He doesn't know what he can do and what he can't do, and what will cause outcry and what he can kind of be more brazen and shatter through. And this time he knows, he understands, he's surrounded by people who are going to do exactly what he wants to do, however he wants to do it, true loyalists. Even tiny things like immigration. The first term they knew they needed kind of MAGA hardliners at DHS if they want to do hardline immigration. What they learned is, well, yes, you need them there, but also there's roles at Health and Human Services, right, that affect immigration. So you need your loyalists there. There's roles in the State Department where you're going to want to make sure you have your people. And so they applied that lesson throughout government. This time they know what they don't know, as someone told us, and as my colleague David Frum observed a couple of years ago. It's sort of like that scene from Jurassic Park where the velociraptors, learn how to open the doors, and that's what we're
Yeah.
witnessing.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you also spoke to allies of his who say he's just having much more fun this time, blowing things up with a twinkle in his eye. Was that your impression? Did he seem like a man who's having fun?
Yeah, on the whole, yes. Even things like bad news headlines in the first term, they would get incredibly upset. And that's not to say that, I mean, we got two, pretty vituperative Truth Social posts in the process of getting this interview. So that's not to say that they don't care about those things, but they've sort of learned how to take a punch. They can handle bad headlines. And also, I mean, the reason in some ways Trump is having more fun is because it's different, right? The first term, all of these tech titans, these tech oligarchs wanted nothing to do with him. They were
Mm.
incredibly critical. This time we have a scene in our story where, they're coming to Mar-a-Lago to pay their respects, to kiss the ring. A couple days before the inauguration, he's sitting there on the patio with someone we spoke to. He holds up his phone, he scrolls through it, and he says, look who called me, right? And it's a list of Tiger Woods and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. And with the exception of Tiger Woods, who's sort of always been a Trump loyalist, those were people who wanted nothing to do with Trump in the first term. So yeah, I get why it might be more fun when all of these billionaires want to, you
Well,
know,
I mean, you asked him directly why he thought the billionaire class, Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos particularly, were sort of prostrating themselves before him this time. What did he say about that?
so he says, it's different. They know me better. But what's interesting is when you talk to his people behind the scenes, they say, look, he is very clear-eyed of, who was with him and when. And so yes, he likes the fact, right, that Jeff Bezos is now, sort of sitting on his, and I should say I used to work at the Washington Post for nearly a decade up until a few months ago. That Jeff Bezos, flies to the inauguration and basically perches himself on Trump's lap, at the Capitol. He likes all of that, but he's also acutely aware of who was with him when. And if you were with him the first term, when you were with him, how much money you've given. For these billionaires, too, we were told he also cares not the size of the check, but sort of the percentage of someone's net worth. So someone worth a couple $1,000,000 giving $100,000 check means more to him than, a Jeff Bezos type giving $1,000,000. So yes, he thinks it's different, but he's also aware of where they were and when they came on board.
It's always been obvious that he doesn't feel particularly governed by the traditional rules of politics, indeed the traditional rules of government. He says something rather complicated about his relationship with the Supreme Court and the sort of constitutional restraints that there could be on some of the stuff he wants to do, such as deporting people, for example. What did you take away from that?
So that was fascinating because we asked him about the Supreme Court twice, first in that phone call and then in the Oval Office about a month apart. And in both times, it wasn't necessarily what I expected. Both times he sort of said, look, you've because he and his vice president, to set some context here, have sort of hinted at maybe you don't follow judicial rulings you disagree with. Maybe justices should be impeached. But both times he sort of said, look, you have to do what the Supreme Court says, right? You got to respect their ruling, the law of the land. In the first interview, he actually sort of, as an aside, digresses and says, look, I think the Supreme Court's been very good. Even those justices appointed by, he calls them Democratic justices. Technically, the court is apolitical, and he means justices appointed by Democratic presidents. But he says, even the Democrats, they've been good. I see them at the State of the Union. I like them. Now, I will say some of this view seems to me to be informed by, it's something he said to us. He says, look, I always win on appeal. I got immunity on appeal. He's referring to the Supreme Court case, the case that went all the way up to the court where he gets presidential immunity. So I think when he's saying you've got to respect the court, he has a belief that the court, or as he would say, his justices, the ones he appointed in his first term, will rule in his favor. And I am a little curious to see, if he stands by this view that you must always respect the rulings of the Supreme Court if and when they actually rule against him.
You've got a great bit of intel in there as well about how his advisors deal with him. There's a quote I'll read out, and listeners will have to forgive me for the profanity which follows. But it goes, some of Trump's advisors have learned to operate by an unofficial rule. They make sure to do things after he says them twice. This is a necessary and important rule because, as one advisor explained, he talks a lot of shit. So I mean that's sort of remarkable that he'll give them the go ahead to something. He'll tell them what he wants them to do. He doesn't mean it. He doesn't mean it until he says it twice.
Well, actually, what I will say is it's twofold. It's striking in two ways. One is this is, an advisor acknowledging to us, look, he says so many things, some of them which sound so crazy. We kind of want to make sure he means it. So that's why we wait for the second time. But in many ways, this felt to me what they were essentially saying was, yeah, we wait till he says it the second time, but then we do it. Then we execute it. On the first term, that wasn't the case. He said things many times, and advisors didn't do it. They sort of treated him as a wayward toddler, right? If your kid your kid wants ice cream, but if you distract them with a toy, maybe they will forego dessert and you can just get them up to bed, right? That's how some of his advisors treated him. They slow walked things. He would ask for things multiple times and they would tell him why he couldn't do them or why they wouldn't do them for him, or they would literally steal sheets of paper off of his desk and hope he would forget about them and he'd never sign them. This time he may need to ask twice, but they're going to do it, and also they know how to do it in a way they didn't the first term.
Yeah. Okay. Look, he also told you that he'd. I mean, effectively. Sorry, I have to get the dog barking in the background. We'll chop that out. He'll calm down. He also told you he'd told off Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary. That's how it sounds, at any rate.
Yeah, it was interesting. We asked him, we were in the Oval Office at a moment where Pete Hegseth has had a lot of negative news cycles, in part because a lot of negative things have been happening at the Pentagon, right? He's sort of replaced his chief of staff. He's fired a few top aides. His wife, who's a former Fox News producer and has no actual role at the Department of Defense, is accompanying him to high level meetings. It came out that he added his wife, his brother, and a personal attorney to a private signal chat that was very similar to the one that we broke in the Atlantic. He had a makeup room installed in the Pentagon. So we kind of put this to the president and we're sort of say, what's going on with Pete Hegseth? And the president said, look, I had a talk with him. He said it was a positive talk. It sort of reminded me of a father saying, I made my disappointment known, but I didn't necessarily scream at my kid or spank them. And the president said, look, I hope Pete Hegseth is going to get his act together. But just coming from Trump, who never likes to show any skepticism of staff until essentially he's ready to fire them and then they're gone, and doesn't like the idea of the media, quote unquote, getting scalps, that to me felt quite notable, that it was clear Trump was aware of what's going on with Pete Hegseth and did not like it and communicated that to his Pentagon chief.
Well, look, it's quite a piece. It's probably the definitive piece of his 100 days so far, and you know he'll read it. So I guess my last question Ashley, is when are you going back?
That unfortunately is not up for me to decide, but we are always happy to go in and obviously interview the president.
Thank you very much indeed, Ashley Parker of The Atlantic, and you can read that piece in The Atlantic now.